hopefully the technology will cooperate. As Anne said, I work at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and we are the state agency charged with protecting public health and the environment. And one of those elements is solid waste management. And one of our goals is to reduce waste that's disposed. So composting is a great way we can all use to reduce our household waste. In the process, it also helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because landfilling organic matter converts it to methane, whereas composting it converts it to carbon products, one of which is humus. And in the form of humus, carbon is sequestered or stored in the soil for hundreds of years. It pretty much locks it in. So it's a small amount, we might think, but it all adds up. And it's a great thing for your soil as well, because it adds nutrients and organic matter that your plants all need. It's nature's recycling system, basically. And then as an individual or a household, you can save money, or as a town, you can save money. If people compost their waste, that much waste won't need to be paid for as disposed tonnage. And you won't have to buy as many bags, and there won't be as many trucks that need to drive around to collect that part of your waste. So what can be composted? Pretty much anything that was once alive is an organic structure, and bacteria and other decomposers are able to break apart anything that was once alive and eat it up and convert it in the process into a decomposed material we call compost. That includes food waste, paper products, which, as you know, comes from trees. So as long as you keep the plastic coating off of the paper, and I try to minimize the ink, although ink has not been found to be a problem. That's an optional thing. But these are tree products, and they will compost just like leaves or sawdust or any other tree product. And that includes yard waste like leaves, pine needles, grass clippings, weeds, prunings, wood chips, sawdust, all these things. And a lot of times we want to clean up our yards and get rid of all those things, but I think of them as compost waiting to happen. So don't let any of that stuff leave your yard if you can help it, because it vastly improves your soil. Manures like horse and cow manure, dog and cat manure I'll talk about later, but generally in a backyard system, you don't want to compost those ingredients. Seaweed has full of minerals, so if you live near the ocean, you can take advantage of that. And the list goes on. But what exactly that you put in your compost pile, or what exactly gets put in any compost system, depends upon the compost system used. And today we're going to be focusing on home composting or backyard composting. Just real quickly, about 25% of the overall material in the waste stream consists of food scraps and prunings and grass clippings and compostable paper. So by composting, you can actually compost as much as 50% of your household waste or more, depending. For instance, if you're a vegetarian, you'd be able to compost pretty much all your food scraps. And if you use paper products, you can compost pretty much all of those as well. So all you have left to recycle is items you can recycle, or plastic, film material, packaging that there's no recycling program for. But other than that, you can really minimize your food waste and all your organic waste. So how many different ways are there to compost? I think there's probably a million, because there's so many different variations on the theme that you can use. And that can be on site, like in your backyard or at a school, in bins, or even in trash cans that you can convert, or buckets or worm bins indoors if you don't have a yard, or just open piles if you live out in an rural area and you just want to compost in an open pile, you can do that as well. Municipal and on-farm composting operations usually use windrows, piles, or drums. And then there's commercial systems that could be in enclosed containment vessels. They get more high tech as they increase in size usually. Aerobically, which is with the presence of oxygen, the byproducts of that are carbon dioxide and humus, and that's what we do with backyard composting. And then there's another type of decomposition called anaerobic decomposition, and that produces methane. It happens inside our stomachs, and it happens in anaerobic digestion systems, which then use that methane, also can be called natural gas, and use it to power their facility. So that's another, there's all different kinds of ways to compost. And who can compost? Everyone. It's an equal opportunity activity. You can do it at home, at work, at school, at play, on the farm, in your basement, on the porch or your deck, in the woods or in the garden. Why not? Really, no reason not to compost. And with that, I am going to show you a video. So hang on while I try and change my screen.
And we do have a question.
Okay, I'll take it.
Do communities usually have restrictions or regulations on composting types?
Yes, municipalities usually are very specific about what they will accept in a municipal program. It may be leaves and yard waste, which is just anything from your yard, although if it's branches, it usually needs to be smaller than 1/2 inch in diameter and less than a few feet long. And if they collect food waste from your municipality, then they will have, whoever does that program will have their own instructions for what they accept. So if you're using a municipal program, you should check with the municipality or the service provider to see what exactly is going to be accepted. Now this video I'm going to show you is produced by the state of Connecticut back in 1992 from using a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency. It cost about $17,000 to produce, and so it was a great effort, and I contributed to the script, and Connecticut put all the material together and created it. One note I'll make is that it predates our compost bins that we now distribute. So I'll be talking about those after the video. The video is about 15 minutes long. It's also, I call it a threefer, because it's not just composting. It also talks about recycling your grass clippings and mulching your wood products, your branches and sticks and stuff. So it's if you have a yard, these are all things you can do. If you don't have a yard, you can share the information with people you know who do, so that they can take advantage of all these materials. When the video starts, it's got music that's kind of loud, and then when the narrator starts, he's softer. So you might need to turn up your volume once the speaker starts. So with that, let's see if I can get this video going. And also, this is available on Connecticut DEP's website. So if you want to watch it later or use it, you can use it to give your own presentations. And it makes it quite simple because it covers the whole process in about 15 minutes. So with that, here we go.
Composting is our way of speeding up and enhancing Mother Nature's decomposition process. On the forest floor, it may take several years before leaves are transformed by naturally occurring organisms into rich organic soil. But by composting, you can create conditions under which these organisms will flourish, turning your yard and kitchen waste into a free, beneficial soil amendment for your garden, lawn, and potted plants in a matter of months. Home composting is less expensive and more efficient than transferring organic wastes to an incinerator, landfill, or even a centralized composting facility. It is environmentally sound, can be done almost anywhere, and enables householders to substantially reduce their trash. This program explains the basics of how to recycle your yard and kitchen waste through home composting, describes how to use your yard waste as mulch, and explains the importance of leaving grass clippings on the lawn. Home composting is not difficult or time-consuming. Most of the work is done by soil organisms. Bacteria, molds, fungi, beetles, centipedes, insects, and earthworms are just some of the organisms which work together to decompose or recycle organic materials into humus. Like us, they need food, oxygen, and water for survival. Food for the microbes is your yard waste and kitchen scraps. These contain carbon for energy and nitrogen for growth and reproduction. Dry, woody things like dead autumn leaves, straw, paper, and sawdust are high in carbon. Fresh, moist materials like grass clippings, vegetable scraps, garden waste, coffee grounds, and manures are good sources of nitrogen. Composting a diverse mix of materials generally results in a good balance of carbon and nitrogen. Oxygen must be available for aerobic organisms to thrive. Oxygen can be supplied by periodically turning or mixing the pile with a pitchfork, or by poking holes in it with a broom handle or special aeration tool. Aeration keeps the compost pile from developing unpleasant odors. Water is essential. With too little water, the organisms will slow down and can die. Too much water will eliminate oxygen, and odors may result. The material in the pile should be kept as damp as a wrung-out sponge. Countless things can be composted at home. Citrus rinds, vegetable stalks and peelings, spoiled fruit and vegetables, coffee grounds, coffee filters and tea bags, eggshells, peanut shells, straw, weeds, garden waste, and paper towels, to name a few. But not everything belongs in the compost pile. Do not add meat or fish scraps, bones, fats, grease, oil, peanut butter, or dairy products such as milk, cheese, butter, mayonnaise, and yogurt. These foods can attract pests or cause odors. Do not add diseased plants, weeds that have gone to seed, or the roots of invasive plants such as quackgrass, wild morning glory, and bittersweet, which may survive the composting process and take root where the finished compost is used. Dog and cat waste can carry parasites transmittable to humans and should not be added to the pile. Using a compost bin to contain your organic materials may be preferable to an open compost pile because it discourages animals, makes the pile easier to manage, helps retain heat and moisture, and tends to look neater. There are many kinds of ready-made bins available through garden centers, department stores, and other retail outlets. Some are small and designed specifically for kitchen waste. These are referred to as digesters. Others are large enough to accommodate both yard and kitchen waste. With little expense and effort, you can build your own bin using scrap lumber, fencing, cinder blocks, pallets, or a combination of materials. A bin must be at least 3 feet wide, 3 feet long, and 3 feet high to provide enough mass to retain the heat generated by the microbes. It shouldn't be bigger than 5 feet in any dimension for ease of handling and to prevent compaction. The bin usually has an open base, which provides drainage and allows the composting materials to come in contact with natural soil organisms. A top is optional. Making sure that only the appropriate food scraps are added to the pile is the best method for keeping animals out of your compost. However, animal-proof bins can be purchased commercially or made by drilling quarter-inch holes in the sides, bottom, and top of a trash can with a tight locking lid. A wooden bin can be animal-proofed by lining it with half-inch metal mesh and securing a top. How fast composting takes place depends on the kinds of materials you add to the pile and the amount of time you're willing to dedicate to composting. The art of composting is simply balancing certain factors, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and moisture, to convert organic items into a rich humus within the time frame you have chosen. If you have little time to spend on composting and there's no hurry for a finished compost, you may want to try the passive method, using a holding bin. It is one of the easiest ways to compost, since no labor is required other than placing wastes in a bin and harvesting the compost from the bottom of the pile about 8 to 12 months later. If you have a large volume of organic wastes or want finished compost sooner, the active method may be more appropriate, using a turning unit. Turning units typically consist of a series of bins or a rotating barrel. This is an active method because the pile is periodically turned or moved into the next bin, which supplies oxygen to the organisms, allowing them to break down the wastes quickly. Weekly aeration can result in finished compost in less than 2 months. Whichever method you choose, passive or active, the recipe for creating a compost pile is the same. Start by placing your bin in a convenient location with good drainage. It can be in the sun or shade. Gather some materials to be composted, keeping in mind diversity, texture, carbon, and nitrogen. Chopping or shredding the material will help speed up the composting process. Put a layer of dry, woody, high-carbon materials, such as leaves, straw, or sawdust from untreated wood, in the bottom of the bin. Sprinkle with water to dampen the materials to the consistency of a wrung-out sponge. Then add a layer of moist, nitrogen-rich materials, such as grass clippings, garden spoils, and cow or horse manure. The thickness of the layers isn't critical, but no layer should be more than 6 inches deep. Mix the 2 layers together. A shovelful of soil or finished compost every so often will add even more organisms to the pile. Continue alternating, mixing, and watering the layers as materials become available or until the bin is full. Don't be surprised if the compost pile is warm on the inside within a few days. Heat is a normal byproduct of composting and indicates that the microorganisms are working to break down the materials. Over time, the volume of material in the bin will shrink. Appropriate kitchen scraps can be added as they become available and should be buried in the center of the pile. Keep a container on the counter while preparing meals to easily collect the kitchen scraps. The container of scraps may be covered and stored in the refrigerator or under the counter until it is emptied into the compost bin. You can continue to put food scraps, coffee grounds, houseplant cuttings, and other organic items into the pile throughout the year. The composting process will slow down during the winter months, but will speed up again when spring arrives. Leaves alone will compost, but it will take a bit longer than if they are mixed with grass clippings, manure, or other nitrogen-rich materials. Although not essential, shredding leaves with a rotary lawnmower or home shredder will accelerate the composting process and quickly reduce their volume when space for composting is limited. You'll know that your compost is ready to harvest when it is dark brown, crumbly, earthy smelling, and no longer resembles the original material. If you have used the passive method, the more finished compost will be found near the bottom of the pile. You may want to screen your compost to remove pieces of woody materials, eggshells, and other items that have not totally decomposed, and return them to the compost bin. Finished compost is referred to as black gold by experienced gardeners because they know how valuable it is. Compost restores life to soil by helping to retain moisture, improve texture, and reduce erosion. It provides plants with essential nutrients in a time-release fashion. Compost may be incorporated into your vegetable or flower gardens about 1 month before planting by applying a 3-inch layer of compost and mixing it thoroughly into the top 4 to 6 inches of soil. Compost can be used as a side dressing during the growing season and mixed into each transplant hole or seed furrow. To make a nutrient-rich potting soil, mix equal amounts of finished compost, soil, and sand. You can use screened compost as a lawn top dressing by spreading it uniformly on the surface to a depth of 1/8 to 1/4 inch. Composting is not the only way to reduce and recycle your yard waste. Shred your leaves and brush into a mulch to use around plants, trees, and shrubs or on slopes. Mulch reduces weed problems, adds nutrients to the soil, moderates soil temperature and moisture, and helps control erosion by protecting the soil surface. Woody mulches are best used in perennial gardens, under trees and shrubs, and as pathway material. Leaves and dried grass clippings are good mulches for annual vegetable and flower gardens. Leaves should be shredded and allowed to degrade slightly before being used. And dried grass clippings should be applied less than 1 inch thick to prevent matting. Mulching with grass clippings, which have been treated recently with herbicides, can harm your plants. As a precaution, mulch with clippings from treated lawns only after 2 lawn mowings. Grass clippings can account for up to 50% of your waste during the growing season. Don't bag and dispose of your grass clippings. If they are not composted or used as mulch, leave them on the lawn where they can help improve the soil. Each bag of grass clippings is equivalent to 1/4 pound of usable nitrogen. During dry spells, clippings left on the lawn help retain moisture in the soil. You can conserve water, reduce the amount of money you spend on fertilizers and garbage bags, and save lots of your own time and energy by recycling grass clippings back into the lawn. To maintain your lawn properly, cut your lawn when it is dry. Mow when it is 3 to 4 inches tall, and never cut it shorter than 2 inches. Use a sharp mower blade and avoid over-fertilizing your lawn. Turf experts agree that clippings do not contribute to thatch. The fact is, grass clippings are almost 80% moisture and decompose quickly. As you have seen, helping to reduce, reuse, and recycle our yard and kitchen wastes is easy and can be very rewarding. Whether you are motivated by having the best garden in the neighborhood, improving our environment, or saving money, home composting, mulching, and leaving grass clippings on the lawn are the smart things to do. To learn more, write the Connecticut Department of Environment.
That's great, Anne. Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you still hear the video?
Yes, you can still hear the video.
All right, hold on 1 second. I have to manage to turn this off. There we go. All right.
So there's a couple of things that came in while we were watching the video. I just want to get to those before we get started.
Great.
So one person just wanted to know about composting for apartments and if there's policies that apartment complexes might have, but you might be addressing that later. So it's up to you if you want to wait and get that later.
No, I'll tell you right now, if you live in a rental unit, you really should get the agreement from your landlord to be able to compost, unless you don't want to do that, and then you can compost indoors using a worm bin. But if you do, generally, if you have a landlord, you should get their approval before you start composting outdoors.
Great. And then somebody asked, if you don't have access to leaves regularly, is there an alternative?
Absolutely. Yes, cardboard is a great alternative. So is paper. If you have any excess paper bags, you can rip those up and use that. In fact, you can collect your kitchen scraps in a paper bag, and then when you dump it in your compost pile, rip up the bag and you'll get carbon in at the same time. Anything else?
And then do the same rules that I believe the question would be, do the same rules that the video was talking about apply for smaller indoor compost containers?
The same rules for apartment dwellers?
No, I think, and Sarah, maybe just follow up with your question if you can. I think she's asking the rules in terms of the layering and turning and adding moisture and things like that.
Yes, it is very similar. It's pretty much the same, except that with an indoor system, I personally prefer to use paper as a carbon source. And can you see the screen now that says composting is easy?
Yep, all good.
So this shows you all your options for browns. And since that video came out, we developed a recipe of 3 parts brown to 1 part green. Now, all browns can be, actually, that can be more than 3 parts. You can compost all browns by themselves. For instance, you can have just a leaf pile, and as long as it's damp, it will compost perfectly well. However, with the green material that's high in nitrogen, that can cause odors if you compost too much of it or you compost it by itself. Like if you've ever smelled a pile of grass clippings that's been sitting in the sun for a couple of days and you dig into that, you might get knocked over by the stink. So green items should not be composted alone. So we developed this recipe by volume because we assume nobody's going to be weighing their leaves and food scraps. So this is a volume-based recipe, and it's not exact. You can just do it by approximately 3 times as much brown stuff as green stuff. And the easiest way of doing that, I find, is to fill my bin up, whether it's an indoor worm bin or an outdoor compost bin, fill it up with browns about 3/4 of the way. So in the fall, get some leaves. In the spring, you might get some leaves. If you don't have any leaves, you might be able to get some leaves from the neighbors when this town collects yard waste. You might actually be able to pilfer a few of those bags of leaves and save them, because in the summer, it can be difficult to come up with enough browns. Another easy way of getting browns is to buy a bale of mulch hay or salt marsh hay, and you just put that near your compost bin, and then every time you need more browns, you can just shake up some of that mulch or hay or into your cover your pile. So there's all these different options. So anyway, back to the recipe, we say about 3 parts brown to 1 part green. And so the easiest way is to fill your bin up 3/4 of the way with browns like leaves or shredded paper. Now, if you don't have leaves, you can also take newspapers, which you also might not have anymore. But if you have newspapers, you can just hold them at the top and rip them into strips. And those also make a good source of carbon. And then once you have your pile filled with a lot of the brown material, you want to dampen it. Add a little bit of soil, because that will add the microbes that will do the work for you after about every 12 inches of fresh material. And then from that point on, you can just take your food scraps and either outside or in your worm bin and dig a hole with your little cultivator or a little trowel into your leafy material, throw in your food scraps, cover it back over with the leafy material, and the carbon material will last for about half a year or more. So you only have to do that really 1 time. So that's why if you start with a bunch of carbon, you can bury your green material into it for like the rest of the year and then just start over again the following year. So that's the recipe. And as far as the green
We've got a couple questions on the recipe stuff. So one person asked, what's wrong with peanut butter?
Great
on the do not add list.
There's nothing wrong with peanut butter on the, but it's used for trapping rodents in the wild and in the homes. Peanut butter makes a great bait for mice and rats. And so that's why we don't want it in the compost pile, because it might attract them to your pile. That's the only reason. There's no reason otherwise why it couldn't be composted. So
if you had an indoor like worm bin,
then it would be
wouldn't
fine.
Be a problem.
Right, because I've never seen a worm bin develop a rodent problem. And I'll show you some images of a worm bin I made so you can see the plastic container, and it has a cover and it's all enclosed so the mice and rats won't go near it.
Great. And as
Any
a
other
follow-up,
questions?
somebody is saying they've heard that they should keep bread out of the compost. Is that a problem?
Bread is not really a problem in a compost pile. It might attract animals. That's one of the reasons it may, you can see it in different instructions. You'll see either to add it or not to add it. It's sort of optional. One issue I found with bread is that if it gets moldy and you haven't covered it, it can be a little icky to breathe. That black mold, you don't want to breathe that in. So if you do compost bread products, just make sure you cover it with the carbon material and it should be fine.
Okay, and the last one so far, somebody's asking if you use the term greens and browns when you're teaching composting to kids, because there's a lot of exceptions to that color rule, like a green is brown coffee grounds. So it doesn't get confusing for kids.
Yes, we do use the browns and greens, and we say, but not everything that's in this green category everything that's in the green category may not necessarily be green. It's just that most of them are. The other alternative words you can use are browns is shorthand for high carbon, and greens is shorthand for high nitrogen. So if you want to teach the little kids those terms, go for it.
Awesome.
Any
Thank
other
you.
questions? Sure. Any other questions so far?
Yeah, we just got somebody asking about eggshells that are not hard boiled.
Yeah, eggshells are fine. Some people rinse them out if they're concerned about a potential salmonella or something, but I've really never heard of that happening. What I found with eggshells, if you don't crush them up, they tend to linger for years because they're mainly a mineral. They're mainly calcium. And so they're good for your soil and your plants because they bring calcium to them. But I usually crush mine just simply in my hand, or if I am wearing gloves, with wearing gloves so I don't cut myself. So crush them up and throw them in. And I always say wash your hands after you compost or garden. That's just sort of a rule of thumb. And so if you throw stuff in your compost pile and you don't have gloves on, just wash your hands afterwards. You'll be fine. Any other questions?
Great, we're ready to move on, I think.
All right, great. Well, while I still have this picture up, I will say this picture or something similar to it is available on the DEP website. You're welcome to print it out and also to use it if you give presentations of your own. So you can see the browns and greens. I say mix or layer materials. You can do it either way. You can either mix everything up all together, or you can just do it as they add materials as they become available. You just want to make sure that you always cover your food scraps with a layer of leaves or paper or other high carbon material. And what that does is it keeps the odors down. It's almost, if you think of a carbon filter as filtering out odors, I'm not sure if that's exactly how it works, but it achieves that. So carbon is your filter from odors. So always keep your pile covered with a layer of high carbon material. And then, as I said, after every 12 inches or so of fresh material, add a few shovelfuls of rich soil or compost. That will get your decomposers in, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. You want to use outdoor soil, unless you're using a worm bin, in which case you don't really need to do that. When you add your worms, there will be enough microbes on there to get the compost going. I'll talk more about the worms details in a minute. And then keep it damp and aerated. Now, dampness can be something you add with a hose, or the rain and snow can get in to dampen it. But if you don't dampen it with a hose, make sure the rain and snow can get in. So if you have a bin with a solid cover and the stuff in there will tend to dry out, because generally as these microbes breathe, evaporation, transpiration, and evaporation will happen. The moisture will go into the air and your pile will tend to dry out. All compost piles generally tend to dry out. So make sure you take the cover off when it's going to rain so the water can get back in. And then as far as
is there like an ideal frequency in terms of dampening? We had a question. Do you make sure it's damp all the time, or do you water intermittently?
Well, for an outdoor pile, you want it to be damp pretty much all the time. And as a general rule of thumb, I find that if the garden is dried out and the plants are wilted, I put some water in the compost pile, but you may not always get around to it. And also, if you have a fairly large pile, the top may dry out, the outside part may dry out, but it should still be damp in the middle. So once it's good and damp, I would say you shouldn't really have to water it more than once a month. And if you add wet material to it, that's another way of getting moisture in, is if you add some coffee grounds or some lettuce or things that are high in moisture, that will add moisture as well. It's mainly the leafy stuff that tends to really be a problem if it dries out. And then as far as aeration, there's two main ways of getting air into a compost. I'm going to just jump ahead to these organisms. Why we say composting is easy is because 99% of the work is done by these microbes, these decomposers, and you want them in your bin. These include bacteria and mold and fungi, as well as earthworms and mites and nematodes, and then the larger organisms that eat these other organisms like centipedes and ants and beetles and things like that. These guys all work together and they all need the same things we do: air, water, and food. So that's why if your pile dries out, the bacteria will just go dormant and things will just slow down. If it gets too wet, then all the air spaces will get filled with water, so they won't be able to breathe, and then they will tend to die and get odors. So you don't want it too wet as well. And in a minute, I'm going to talk, you want it to be about 50% moisture. But let me just go back to, so as far as the aeration, what I was saying is that one way to keep your compost aerated for those microbes is to turn it. You could turn it with a pitchfork or a shovel. But there's an alternative to that, which is you can build your pile with air passages in it. And so you can put coarse material in the bottom. I think they showed that in the video. Put coarse material in the bottom, and every so often add some coarse material. And that should allow, as long as there's air holes in the compost container, that should allow enough air to get in there passively. So you don't necessarily have to turn your compost pile. And then if you can buy a compost bin design that helps with the aeration, then that's another way you can make aerating it easier. But don't let turning compost be a barrier for you, because most piles can get enough air just from passive aeration. So I consider turning compost to be optional. And then let me just quickly go through the things of what we don't recommend adding. Meat bones and grease and dairy products generally will smell really bad, and they'll either attract animals or they will repel you and your neighbors because of the stink. So you don't want that. So, and then peanut butter, as I said, is used to trap rodents, so that might attract them to your pile. So try to keep that out for an outdoor pile. Dairy products also can smell bad. Cooked foods with sauces or butter, like macaroni and cheese, it might smell so good that it might attract animals. Dog and cat manure, but otherwise cooked foods are fine. There's no reason you can't compost cooked foods. We're just saying if you want to be conservative, keep the cheese sauce out and the butter out, because it might smell too good. Dog and cat manure can carry pathogens that can be transmitted to humans. That's the reason we don't recommend adding that. Diseased plants, some of those diseases may be able to carry over through the compost into your, when you use the compost. So try to keep diseased plants out, such as like if you grow roses and the roses get black spot, which is a fungal disease, I never add those to my compost pile because that will just spread it more. Weeds that have gone to seed can sprout in your compost when you use it. If you're using your compost when down in the ground when you plant, then that's less of a concern because it's buried. But if you're going to spread compost over your lawn, then you don't want every weed you've pulled to come back up. So the trick to that is just try to pull the weeds out before they go to seed or before they get flowers on them. That may be easier said than done. So if they've gone to seed, you can just chop off the bottom part into the compost and then throw the seed head into the trash. You don't want them reproducing. And then weeds that spread by roots and runners can often take root when you use your compost. So it's better not to add bittersweet or poison ivy or other vines. Poison ivy you don't want to burn or compost yeah, it's one of those materials that's really not suitable for composting, so it's actually okay to put it in the trash. Wash your hands afterwards, of course, and use gloves. So yeah, this is your workforce. And do we have any other questions that have come in?
We do. So we have somebody asking if it's effective to bury food scraps in the yard.
Yes. Yes, you can bury your food scraps directly in the soil. I'm glad you asked that because I do that with banana peels. When I don't want to put banana peels in my worm bin because they might result in fruit flies. Fruit flies, we may all get fruit flies just by virtue of having fruit in our kitchens or dining rooms. And what happens is the fruit flies in the tropics may lay their eggs on the fruit, on the surface of the bananas or the oranges. And then 3 days later in your house, they hatch and you have fruit flies. So I tend to try to put banana peels are a favorite of fruit flies. In fact, you can use banana peels as bait to trap fruit flies in case you get them. Whether you do worm composting or not, you might want to trap fruit flies. I put my banana peels out in my garden. They're high in potassium and supposedly they're good for roses. So I just put them out around the rose bushes and cover them with the mulch, and they disappear in about a week. And you can do that with other food waste as well. That's an old-fashioned practice, or an old practice of tradition of composting, is just burying the food scraps directly in the soil, covering it over, and then the next year that's where you put your garden bed. And there will be worms there, and the soil will be really rich. So that's, and then the next year you bury your food scraps in the garden path, and then the next year you move and put your garden bed there. So certainly do that. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more. Is there any concern using pressure treated wood for compost bins?
Yes, I would not recommend it. Pressure treated wood has some chemicals, basically some arsenic and copper and some basically some toxic chemicals that can it's possible they could leach out into your compost. And also if you build a raised bed, I wouldn't recommend using pressure treated wood for that, because you never really know. I mean, pressure treated wood, those chemicals are supposed to keep the wood from decomposing, but eventually it may decompose, and then some of those chemicals might get released into the compost or the soil. So it's not a good application. Anything
All right,
else?
a few more coming in.
All right.
Are orange peels compostable? Do they need to be cut into small pieces?
Orange peels, if they're cut into quarters, that would be fine. If they dry out, they get tough as leather. And so, like with many things, if they dry out, they're not going to compost very well. But if you bury them in your compost and you have a mix of other ingredients, they should be fine. I have read that you shouldn't put a lot of citrus peels in worm bins. And I have not really, I've done it and I haven't run into any problems. The only thing is when you have a lot of citrus peels in the wintertime, say, and you put them all in your worm bin, they tend to get a little smelly. So you just can use your nose to judge. If it starts to smell, then back off on the orange peels. You could probably put them out in the yard and they would break down that way as well. Although if you have neighbors, they might not, you might want to bury them. But no, they're fine to compost overall.
All right, and does it make any difference putting non-native fruit in your compost, such as pineapple or avocado pits in Massachusetts?
No, it doesn't matter. Composting, home composting is I call it a hyper local activity, and that's one of the beautiful things about it is, you know, with local gardening and local food eating and local everything being so desirable these days, to be able to make your own compost is as local as you can get, especially if you put in it just things that are from your yard. However, it's not going to have any impact on overall impact if you add non-native things to your food scraps to your compost pile. So don't worry about it. You might get a pineapple. You might get a pineapple growing, or avocados growing from your compost pile. So if you see things sprouting, just take them out and put them in a pot with a little compost, and you'll have a new plant.
Great. What is the best thing to do when things in the worm bin get heavily moldy, like blue powder covered lemon wedges? Is that mold toxic or harmful?
Bury them down below and add paper on top. I always, with a worm bin, you can add as much paper as you want. If you add too much food scraps, I think of a worm bin as sort of a very small compost operation. So you can't put in as much material as you could put in an outdoor pile. So you kind of can just use your judgment and use your nose. If it starts to smell or you start to get fruit flies, then back off adding food scraps. But no, if it gets moldy, it seems like it's probably a good moisture level, which the worms need. But I would just try to cover it with about 4 inches of ripped up paper or other, and you can use paper towels or the paper towel cores or toilet paper cores or paper bags or shredded newspapers, those types of things. And just keep it, and you can't overdo the paper, so just keep adding paper whenever you have it available, and that will keep I keep the top layer of my worm bin dry, and then down when I dig into it to add stuff to it, it's damp, but then I cover it back over with dry stuff.
Great, that's good. Let's keep moving.
All right, so how to compost. You want your food for those microbes, carbon and nitrogen. Moisture is about 50% is what you want. Oxygen, whether you get it in there passively or actively, just get it in there. And habitable temperature, if you read up, if you want hot compost, which is an optional thing, I usually don't get hot compost because you need a big pile to be built all at once. And then the microbes go thrive and flourish, and the pile heats up. But most of the time I have a bucket here, a bucket there, and it's not enough. But if you want your pile to maintain its heat and not freeze solid through the winter, it should be a minimum of 1 cubic yard, which is, you can convert to 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, or any variation thereof. That works out to 27 cubic feet. And that is a big enough mass that it will insulate itself. Again, when you have a worm bin, it's in a tiny little 14-gallon bucket, so you can compost in any size container, but you might read this if you want, a hot, active. The most optimal size for an outdoor compost pile would be 1 cubic yard or 27. Optional ingredients. People sometimes wonder if they need to add commercial compost starter. That's basically dried up bacteria, and it's optional. If you add some soil from outdoors or some compost if you have it, or some horse manure, that will add the bacteria in there. And once you get it in, as long as you leave some compost in the bottom of your compost bin after you've taken out the finished compost, always leave a little bit in there, and that's like your sourdough starter. That'll help your next batch to be going, and you won't have to worry about continually adding these items. Once it's in there, it's like your oven is preheated and it'll keep working. Lime, sometimes people wonder if they should add lime it helps reduce odors, and generally it's optional. You don't have to do it, and if you do, it will raise the pH, and you don't want to raise the pH too much, so just use a little bit. Wood ashes from a fireplace also raise the pH, and sometimes people wonder if they can add that. So, and the answer is yes. Just be careful that you only, I say, consider it like a condiment, like salt and pepper. You just put a little sprinkling in after every 12 inches or so. Don't put dump a big bucket in, or it will throw the pH off, and it might slow things down. You can also sprinkle wood ashes on your yard. It will help raise the pH of your soil. It's good for the grass or your garden. So those are some other things you can do with wood ashes. As I talked about earlier, these are the things you don't want to compost in a low-tech system. A backyard system is typically a low-tech system, and so is a worm bin. A high-tech system would be like an anaerobic digestion unit that can handle these items. But in our small little backyard systems, we don't want to put these things in, mainly because of the reasons I already said. They'll create odors or could attract animals. Large branches will just get in your way. But small branches are typically fine. I have a couple of brush piles myself because I found out that birds like to nest in them. So if you have space and you don't mind the aesthetic of a brush pile, it provides habitat for some other creatures. And eventually it will they'll break down in their own time. So it's another way to handle things that you might otherwise think you have to clean out of your yard.
We have a couple more questions about things that we can compost. So can you compost shredded white office paper?
Yes, you can. You can also recycle it and then it will be made back into paper. So that's typically what we recommend. But if you have a shortage of carbon, you can just rip up your office paper. And I've been known to put some old material, some old confidential papers that I didn't have a shredder. I put them in my worm bin and no one will ever read those documents.
And can compostable silverware be composted in yard systems?
It'll take forever, but theoretically it supposedly can be composted. A lot of compostable silverware is rated to be composted in a commercial facility where it will be shredded up and subjected to very high temperatures, which will help it to decompose. And I've tried different compostable materials in my worm bins or even my outdoor compost piles without great success. They just, I'm not convinced that they really do decompose, because to me, if something is biodegradable, the bacteria should be able to biodegrade it in a worm bin or a compost bin. And if it doesn't, then I'm like, meh. If it's still there a year later, then meh, I'm not going to keep using it. So you can try anything. I tried composting Dixie cups because I thought they were wax paper, which they are. And wax will decompose. So wax cardboard you can actually compost, or wax cups. Most of the time it's plastic and you think it's wax, like milk cartons. You used to be wax coated, but now they're plastic coated and the plastic will just remain. Anyway, I tried Dixie cups and I ended up with these little circles of plastic film in my compost, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was the bottom of the Dixie cup has a plastic lining. So it's very difficult to distinguish. But if you get plastic in your compost, you can remove it. So it's not the end of the world. Any other questions?
And somebody asked if an earth machine compost bin is 3 by 3 by 3.
No, an earth machine is 10 cubic feet, which is about 1/3 of 27 cubic feet. So if it doesn't heat up, that's probably why. But like I said, it will still work. Even the smaller bins will still work. Anything else?
Good to go.
Okay, so along the lines of what else not to add to your compost would be toxic materials like pesticides. Hopefully you don't use pesticides in your yard, but if you do, then you don't really want to add those materials to your compost, or if you do, make sure you let them compost for at least a year, and usually time will degrade those if you should have them. Petroleum products are not good, like gasoline. Chlorine, if you add water from your swimming pool and it has chlorine in it, it will kind of kill off the microbes in the compost, so don't add that. And treated wood, as I mentioned before, sometimes those chemicals can leach out into the compost. Trash, stuff like glass, metal, and plastic was never really alive, so it's not going to decompose, and it's just going to end up being an unsightly item in your compost in your garden, so just don't put those in. And then for best results, try to exclude diseased plants. A lot of those diseases will actually get killed off by the compost organisms, so it's not the end of the world if some get into your compost. But you can. This is one of these things you use your own judgment on, and it will be fine. Weeds that have gone to seed, as I said, the seed. If it's something you never want to see again, then don't put those seeds in your compost pile. When I have a lot of weeds that or plant material that I don't really want to spread in my yard, I add it to my brush pile. I have like an outdoor pile in the woods that is really never going to see the light of day. And so most weeds need sun to grow. And if it's in a shady brush pile, you can put them out there, and you know what happens is the birds will use them for nesting material. So it's all good. If you forget to weed your garden, throw it out back and in the shady spot. Weeds that spread by roots and runners could spread in your compost as well. You can actually kill them off by spreading them out on a hard surface like a driveway and letting them get all dried and crispy, and then they could be added to your brush pile and they won't resprout. And then invasive plant parts, like any piece of a bittersweet plant, for instance, can resprout, and the seeds as well. So if you have invasive plants in your yard or your woods, we always recommend that you just put those in the trash so that you don't continue to spread those, like garlic mustard or purple loosestrife. So these things, although purple loosestrife is pretty, but anyway, if you have invasives that you know of, then you should just put those in the trash. And then, as we've talked about, these are the variety of things you can compost. I didn't mention pine needles. If you have pine needles, you can compost those, but they do take a long time to decompose. And we recommend not to fill your bin up with more than about 10% pine needles, or it will really take a long time to decompose, and it might become acidic, your compost. So, but what I do recommend with pine needles is that you can use those as a mulch, especially around conifers like pine trees or rhododendrons or blueberries. All those kind of evergreens will thrive with pine needle mulch. So use them that way. Yeah, so yep, the source of nitrogens, which are not always green, can be a little confusing, but we think greens is a little easier than nitrogen in terms, but it's not exact. Oh, carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is probably a little more detailed than I really want to go into. Just, I'll just say that when you're reading about composting, you might read that the carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's basically the amount of carbon to the amount of nitrogen. It's a ratio. And on the molecular weight level, it should be 30:1 to get fast, hot composting. However, if the carbon to nitrogen, if it gets higher than that, like say with a leaf pile, like it says here, browns, they may range, every ingredient has its own unique carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's a math project to come up with a ratio where everything you add will average out to 30:1. And it's just too hard to really do it. So we've created a simple little 3:1, 3 parts brown to 1 part green. Basically by weight, you want to generally about half and half, but since the browns tend to be lighter, we say put in more browns and to the amount of greens. So that's where we came up with this simple rule of thumb to achieve an average 30:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is to build a pile using a mix of about 3 parts brown to 1 part green. For example, 75% leaves and 25% grass clippings or vegetative food scraps. And that will approximate that 30:1 ratio. As I said, if you just put in leaves, it'll be higher than 30:1, but it'll still decompose. It might take longer than if it's mixed with greens, but that's okay as long as you're not in a huge hurry. And you can interchange any of the other ingredients from the browns and greens category to use that. And as I said, use your nose. Well, somewhere in here it says use your nose. If it smells, then add more carbon material, basically. Here's some examples. This is at Marshfield Fair. We have a little composting going on behind the administration building in 3 New Age composters. And we put in the high nitrogen material, and then we use cardboard and hay and straw for our carbon material, and water it when needed and cover it. And then the following year, we come back and harvest the compost and give it out at the fair. So yeah, that works well. Moisture is important. It should be, as we said, about 50% moisture. And how can you tell? Basically, it should be damp to the touch and not dripping wet. If it's dripping wet, then it's too wet. If the leaves rustle when you stir them, then they're too dry. And if it's too wet, you can add more paper, shred up some paper bags like you can see up here and throw those in, or some dry leaves. And if it's too dry, you can add some coffee grounds and other damp materials. And if it's still too dry, then add some water or let it get rained on. So that's not too hard, but you do have to, the basic rule of thumb is if your compost pile dries out, it will just sit there forever. So that's, a lot of times people are saying, like, they'll say to me, like, my compost, nothing happened. And I'm like, is it dry? And they're like, yeah. And I say, so that's why it sort of goes into dormancy. And the good thing is, all you have to do is add water and it will start composting again. So just like Betty Crocker, just add water and you'll get your brownies. Might not be edible, but it will look like brownies. So in the end, so it's not too difficult. Figure out a system that works best for you. Sometimes a way of getting water into your pile is if you have a food waste bucket and you take it out to the compost, you can rinse it out and then dump the rinse water into your compost pile as a way of getting more moisture in. Do we have questions? No?
We have one, which I think is kind of fun. How do acorns do in compost?
They last a long time, but eventually they will decompose. So I tend to pile up the acorns in a corner for the squirrels. And then after a long time, they'll eventually, I do it on a rock because if I do it on the ground, they will sprout. In a compost bin, they might sprout and they might, they might last a long time, but if you're not in a hurry, you can compost them. If you leave them in a pile on a rock, they won't sprout as easily, and then they'll turn into like a wood mulch. Quite nice. So compost systems. Generally, if you're composting food scraps, you want it to be an enclosed system. If it's just leaves, it can be a leaf pile. It doesn't have to even be enclosed. If you have rodents in your area, like if you live in the city and there's already a rat problem in your neighborhood or in the whole city, then you want to really have a secure compost container. And you can do that by covering the whole thing with half-inch wire mesh, or using a metal trash can with holes drilled in it is easier. As we said, volume will help maximize the hot composting, but again, it's not a requirement. If you have a built-in aeration system in your design, like a turner, or in the case of the New Age composter, it's got a floor that aerates it. That's nice. It should be easy to use. You don't want it to be, so difficult that you can't manage it. And if you don't have a yard, a deck, or a porch, you can have an indoor system. So these are the compost bins that MassDEP has on state contract, and about 150 cities and towns across the state sell them at a discount, and maybe $25. These are the costs that they actually cost that the town pays. So for the bin 24, which is the original, and it's 24 cubic foot capacity, those now cost $59. So if your town sells them for less, then they are giving you a subsidy and a discount. And that's a great thing. And DEP actually has a grant program where we incentivize towns to do that. So if you aren't sure if your town sells compost bins, probably the easiest way is to go on your town's or city's website and go on the recycling page and then see if it's on there. And if not, you could do a little search on compost bins, and if they sell them, it will generally come up. We have a list on our website at mass.gov, so you can do that as well. Just go to mass.gov and then type compost bins in the search box, and you'll come up with the page that has bins and the list of towns that we know of that sell them, but that's kind of always changing, so you can check locally as well. This bin is made in New Bedford out of recycled detergent bottles, and it's got a cone-shaped floor and cover, and that helps hold in air and hold in moisture and keep animals out. But it has holes in the cover so rain can get in and air can get in. And then the cone-shaped floor, this is a cutaway view. It's kind of confusing to see, but it protrudes up into the bottom of the pile and it has holes in it. and so it aerates it from below. This shows some detergent bottles with the caps on underneath the cone to help hold it up so it won't collapse. It also comes with a brace that goes under there, or you can put rocks under it to keep it from collapsing. Because what happens is it aerates itself 24/7, and it's the easiest, simplest process I've ever seen. So I try to keep the floor up intact. And then, so some towns sell these, some towns don't. If your town doesn't, there's a place in Boston that sells them called the Boston Building Resources. And they sell building materials and compost bins and rain barrels. And they sell to anybody. So if you can go there, and they have a website, it's bostonbuildingresources.com. And they're doing sales now as well. They have a certain way of doing it. So you can contact them to get a bin there. Another bin on state contract is, as someone mentioned, is the Earth Machine. And this one is 10 cubic foot capacity. It costs $49, almost $50. So a lot of towns sell them for $25, which is a great discount. They have a little door at the bottom, which makes getting the compost out a little bit easier. But they do have a solid cover. So I found when I added leaves to this bin, I needed to take the cover off when it rains, so the rain could get in. I find sometimes that when people get this bin, it's about the size of a trash can, a little bit bigger, but people think it's just for food scraps. So then they fill it with food scraps, and it gets to be a stinky, slimy mess. So even if you have a small bin, you still need to add some carbon material, whether it's leaves or paper. But they work fine. And then we have this other bin on state contract. It's a little pricey, so I don't know of anyone that actually sells it at this point, $154. And it's a dual compost tumbler, and it's sold by this company, Go Green Solutions. If your town doesn't sell them and you wanted one of these, you can just go on their website. They sell them for like $169 retail, because the state contract price is a wholesale price. So you might have to pay a little more, but you know, if you have a deck or something, it might work out well for you because it's all contained. It's 7 cubic foot capacity. Each of these drums has 3.5 cubic feet. So it's not a high capacity composter, but I'm sure it still works fine. Where should I put my compost bins? I use the word bins, plural, because the more the better. The more the better. Because if you have one bin and you fill it up, and then you start a second bin and fill that one up, and it takes you 6 months to fill up each one, by the time you filled up your second bin, your first bin should be just compost, and you should just be able to easily access your finished compost. So that's the sort of how the 3-bin turning system came about, because people had like a bin for fresh stuff, and then they turn it into, and there would be the medium stuff, and then they'd have the 3rd bin would be for the finished stuff. But that involves turning. But if you do have 2 or more bins, you can use them sequentially, and it makes it just much easier to access your finished compost. So how much space do you have will impact upon that. You want it to be convenient. Don't put it way out back, because then you'll never go out there, and you have to be able to reach it with your hose in case it dries out. And proximity to water source is a faucet, not wetlands. Some people fill up their wetlands with leaves, and that's not, it's not a good practice. We don't want to fill up wetlands with leaves, even though leaves are natural. We don't want to fill wetlands with them. We want to leave wetlands to be wetlands. Appearance, how does it look? My main thing is I try to make it invisible or put it somewhere where no one can see it. That way, out of sight, out of mind. Drainage, you don't want it to be in a puddle of standing water. Exposure, whether it's in the sun or the shade, it really doesn't matter. The sun will heat it up a little more, but it will also dry it out a little faster. Whereas the shade, it won't get as much external heat, but it won't evaporate, the water won't evaporate as quickly. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Whichever kind of location you want, it will work in. And you know, you'll read different things where some will say it's better in the sun and some will say it's better in the shade. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, really. Environmental considerations, as I said, not in a wetland. put it near your gardens or where the compost will be used. That's the, that should be, make it convenient. And with your neighbors, basically, if you can avoid problems, that's better than having to deal with them later. So try to keep it out of sight and it will be out of mind. Try to keep it from getting a terrible odor. If it gets a terrible odor, a quick remedy is to cover your compost pile with about 3 inches of soil, and it will just filter out the odors. And then just wait. And after about 3 months, you can dig in there and see if it's calmed down. But you don't want to dig into a stinky pile because you'll just release that stench. So just cover it with soil, let it do its thing, and eventually it'll take care of itself. But try to keep that from happening if you can. Tools of the trade, what do you need? Well, my basic tools are gloves, a hose, a cultivator, which is this thing here, a little trowel, a hoe, because I use this bin that a pitchfork isn't going to work with this bin. So I use a hoe and a shovel for harvesting the compost. And you might want some buckets if you don't have a wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrow is optional. If you don't need a wheelbarrow, you don't have room for a wheelbarrow, you can just put your compost in buckets. How do you get your compost out of your bin that you've been adding to it all year? Well, around this time of year, if you haven't been adding too much, it should just be pretty much dried leaves on the top. And then you can just put your gloves on and dig down and you'll get to this brown looking stuff and it's almost like soil. It may still have some leaves, but if it's been there 6 months to a year, even if there's some bits of leaves, if it's mostly soil-like, then it's fine to use. You just take it out, put it in a bucket, and then you can either use it for seedlings or you can mix it in, put it in your house plants. And as I said, if there's still some bits of leaves, they'll just decompose the rest of the way over time, and don't worry about it. It doesn't have to be 100% decomposed in order for it to still be beneficial. Another way is to take your cultivator and peel back the leaves, or even a hoe and peel back the leaves from one side to the other till you get to the compost underneath, and then either put it with a trowel, dig it out with a trowel into a bucket, or dig it out with a shovel into a wheelbarrow. And that's about 15 minutes later. I got half this bin emptied, and it's not totally composted, but it's only April. So I actually just did this for the photo. I actually put it back in my bin because if it sits, I don't need it right this very minute. So when I need it, it'll be there. And the longer it sits in your bin, the more composted it will become. And if you don't want to screen your compost, just let it get to be a year old and it eventually will be like as if it had been screened. What about prunings? I had this plant that it was all full of these dead stalks, and I pruned it way back. Then I had a big pile of these brown dead stalks, and I'm like, well, those are brown ingredients, so I'll put them in my compost bin, which it then filled up. So I'm like, well, that's not going to work very effectively. So I took my little pruning shears and I cut them up into smaller pieces, and I discovered that it was actually easier to break them up with my gloved hands than to prune them, but this is just to give you the idea. And by the time I crushed them all up and broke them into small pieces, my bin was ready to still go. It wasn't all full. So, it's easy. It took me about 10 minutes. So if you don't have a yard or other outdoor space, try composting indoors by making a worm bin. No one has to know unless you want them to. This is where they won't know. And then if you want them to know, you turn it around and put a sign on it. But, generally, this is a pretty innocuous container that I keep in my kitchen. This is my kitchen, actually. And I keep it, this is my little recycling station, my trash, my recycling, and my composting. So when it's time to add I make a salad and I have a piece of lettuce that came off or a carrot bottom, I open up my bin, and this is what it looks like because I keep paper on the top of it. And then I'm showing this with gloves. Truthfully, I don't usually wear gloves, but I figured I'd be on the conservative side and just show you with gloves. A little less gross. I mean, I don't think it's gross at all. And if you do it, if you don't overfeed it, it won't smell. I'm serious when I say this is in my kitchen, I can't smell it. Partly because it's on the floor. If it was at nose level, I might smell it, and it would just be an earthy smell. But I keep it on the floor, and it's literally, I don't smell it. No one knows it's there. So anyway, open it up, and on the top, it's going to look like this because I keep dried paper as the top layer. So I take this little plastic trowel that I have to dig down. I dig a little hole till I get to the damp part. That's where the worms are. And then I collect my stuff in a little recycling container. I don't even have a fancy food waste scrap bucket because it just goes straight in the worm bin. The onion peels and the coffee grounds go in there, and I cover it back up with paper and close it back up, and that's that. And as long as you add about a cup each time, and maybe every 2 to 3 days, if you put in like a couple cups of food scraps every day into a bin of this size, which is about a 14-gallon bin, it will overwhelm the composting process. The reason you add worms to your compost bin, I don't know if I don't have a picture of the worms handy, but it speeds up the compost process and it aerates it. So that's the reason. You could compost indoors without worms, but the worms speed it up. But the whole process is very similar to the outdoor process. It requires microbes to break the stuff down, and then the worms eat the slimy stuff that the microbes have broken down. So it's not like they have teeth and they can just do everything, really quickly. So it takes a little time. So just don't overfeed it. Start small, and if you can't smell it, then you can add more. Add the food scraps to a different part of the bin each time. So then, like first you add it, dig a hole here, bury it. Then next time dig a hole here, bury it. Then next time dig a hole over here and bury it. And then go back here and bury it. And then by the time you get back here, this stuff you buried here should be brown, look like this, and then you're good to go again. So that's kind of in a nutshell how to do it. Now, you don't want to get fruit flies. The trouble with indoor composting are fruit flies and fungus gnats. So the easiest way of not getting fruit flies in a worm bin is, number one, don't overfeed it with fruit scraps. Number two, and to do that, just use your judgment. Like I said, if you can't smell it and you just put in a little bit each time and it starts to disappear before you add more, then you're fine. Another thing you can do is put your food scraps in the freezer first for 3 days or so, or a week. And then I don't know the exact length of time it takes, but after a couple of days, the fruit fly larvae that are on that fruit waste, or that could be on the fruit waste, will be killed by being frozen. So then you pull it out of your freezer, let it thaw for an hour, a couple hours, because you don't want to freeze out your worms. Let it thaw and then dump it in your worm bin. So that way I've been doing that at the office, and I have a couple worm bins at the office, and in the basement actually, because it wasn't welcomed in the actual office space because I got fungus gnats, which people didn't like. Fungus gnats like fungus, so that's why I've learned to keep the top layer of paper dry, and that tends to reduce the attraction of fungus gnats. But anyway, if you get fruit flies, stop adding fruit or food waste to your worm bin. Keep adding paper scraps, because that'll kind of put a barrier down and help reduce any odors that's attracting the fruit flies. But don't add any more fruit until you've trapped all your fruit flies. You make a trap. These are holes in the top of a plastic container that I punched with a knife, and I just punched these holes that are about 1/4 of an inch in diameter so a fruit fly can get in. Then you take the container and you pour some red wine vinegar into it, or put some banana peels in there and leave it on the counter, not in your worm bin, but near your worm bin, on the counter somewhere. And the fruit flies, if they are around, will go through these holes to get into that red wine vinegar, and they'll either drown, or you can take it outside and open it up and let them go outdoors. You can also use a banana peel as bait as well, and that way they won't drown. So if you don't want to drown the fruit flies, use a banana peel as bait. The other way I said I prevent myself from getting fruit flies, or I think it helps, is I put my banana peels straight out in the garden around the plants, because they do tend to be linked with fruit flies. So yeah, that's about it for that. And these are some resources. The MassDEP has a web page that here's the link. It's home composting and green landscaping resources. There's all kinds of resources on there. That's the link. But if you lose the link, or you just want to look around, just go to mass.gov, to the beginning of the website, And from there, you can go in the search box and type in compost bins or composting. It'll bring you to this page. Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection has these great videos. There's other ones there as well as the one we saw today. And those are available for free, so you can go there and watch those. Cornell University has some great composting resources of all kinds, including home composting and worm composting. You get more material there. The U.S. Composting Council has a lot of information, and including a fact sheet on composting, residential composting during COVID-19. You can read that. It basically says the composting process will kill off the coronavirus. Just make sure you wash your hands after you compost, like usual. It's really no new different practice. Also, but any surface that you touch in the compost process, like if you have a kitchen scrap pail, make sure you clean the handle of the pail like you would everything else in your kitchen, and that should be fine. If you want to get earthworms, you can find them outdoors under the leaves. They're naturally occurring. I have a picture, but I didn't have time to include it, unfortunately. But you can just dig down under a pile of leaves in the woods, and most likely you'll find some little red wigglers, and you can just bring those indoors and add them to your worm bin. If you can't find any worms or you don't have access to leaves on the ground, you can order them. You can go online to find places to order them. This is a place in Connecticut that we've used for the Green Team program to purchase worms for schools. I didn't mention the Green Team. We promote composting for schools. So if you're teaching your kids now, go to thegreenteam.org, including the word the, and there's all kinds of composting resources on there, lesson plans and everything as well. So you're welcome to, that's all free. Welcome to use those materials. And then if you want to get your soil tested, UMass has a soil testing lab. So it's always a good idea to get your soil tested to see how it's doing. And I guess that's about it. Some books, the Rodale Guide to Composting for worm composting. Worms Eat My Garbage is a classic and still a great resource. Biocycle is a journal about composting that's great. And Organic Gardening, well, you might have to go to Back Issues because they don't make that anymore, but there's other magazines. But yeah, I just realized that's no longer with us, unfortunately. So here's my contact information. You're welcome to email me or call me. I'm working remotely, but I'm checking my voicemail. So if you leave me a message or send me an email, I will get back to you. So that's about it. And I think we're at the end of our time. If anyone has any more questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Yep, we got a few more. So we had somebody suggest that you should limit the number of oak leaves because of the tannins in an outdoor or in composting in general. Would they also be acidic as well?
That's a great question. I'm glad someone made that comment because you might read that, but in reality, when you are in an oak forest, they could be acidic, but typically even acidic material, this is one of the mysteries of composting that is not completely understood, but you can add acidic materials like even coffee grounds or oak leaves into a compost pile, and by the time those microbes have decomposed it into humus, the pH is going to be right around neutral. It's not magic, but it's like magic. So don't worry about oak leaves. I have tons of oak leaves in my yard, and I actually use them as mulch because I have more than I can compost. Plus, when you use oak leaves for mulch, or any kind of leaves, if you use leaves for mulch, they will decompose in place and build up the soil. So it's almost like it's easier than putting in a compost pile and then taking it back out. You just have to get used to the appearance of leaves as mulch, which some people don't like. But after a while, when you see how beneficial they are for your soil, the tannins will just be mixed in and into the soil and dissolved, and it's not a problem. And so don't worry about oak leaves. The main problem with oak leaves is when they dry out, they don't decompose. And sometimes people will ask me, they'll say, I have a lot of oak leaves and they'll never decompose. And the trick is to add water and a little bit of soil. And they dry out, they're tough as leather. But just like in the woods, if they didn't decompose, we would be in deep doo-doo or deep leafage because we'd be covered with leaves. They decompose in the woods, they'll decompose in your compost pile. So they're all good. Anything else?
We also had somebody suggest that you shouldn't put pineapple in with your worm bin because there's an enzyme in pineapple that affects the worms.
Yes, I'm glad someone raised that point. I was not aware of that until recently. So yes, that person or someone told me about that, and I'm sorry I didn't include it. So don't add pineapple to your worm bin because of the enzymes.
And that there's a difference between your sort of generic outdoor worm and red wrigglers. That red wrigglers are champion composters.
Yes, yes, there's many different kinds of worms. Red wigglers, and they're divided by category. One of the main features that distinguishes them from each other is where they dwell in the soil. So the red wigglers, which are small and reddish, I'm sorry I didn't get a better photo. But they're only about maybe 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches at full. If you get a really big one, they're small. And they're red in color. They actually have hemoglobin in them, and they're red in color. They're called red wigglers. There's some scientific names, but I'm not going to bother you with that. But and they're surface dwellers. They live. That's why I said if you go dig under a leaf pile, you might find them. And they're they said like your generic outdoor worms. There's a variety of worms, but the worms that you're likely to find on the surface of decomposing leaf litter or decomposing organic matter on the top of the soil is likely to be the red wigglers because those are the surface dwellers. And that's why they're happy, dare I say, they seem to be happy in a worm bin because they live in the top 6 to 8 inches of decomposing material. That's their preferred habitat. The called garden worms tend to go deeper in the soil, and they're like mid-level soil dwellers, and they're usually grayer, and they're about 3 inches long. Those are not going to be so happy in your worm bin because they eat organic material, but that's not their preferred environment. They like taking their leaves and then going down 2 or 3 feet. So, or maybe 15 inches. The deep dwellers are the night crawlers. Those are the worms that are about 6 inches long, and they go down as far as 6 feet into the soil, and they'll drag their leaves with them and line their burrows. And they will not be happy in a worm bin. They'll try and get out because they can't. They want to go down deep. So that's the main difference in a nutshell. And none of them are native, actually. They're all related to the Lumbricus species, which is European, but they were brought over by the early settlers, either on purpose or by accident with their plant material. Whichever it was, they arrived and they've naturalized. And it's mainly a good thing. Basic rule of thumb, wherever the people have cultivated the land and settled, you're very likely to find all these non-native Lumbricus earthworms. The good news is they aerate your soil, they add organic matter, and they're beneficial to gardeners. The rule of thumb or the caveat is don't take your fishing bait up to the northern hardwood forests in the wilderness and release them when you're done fishing, because they can eat the leaf litter faster than the normal ecosystem would have done without those non-native worms, and it can disturb the ecosystem that's in nature. So just, in your garden, they may not be native, but we love them anyways. But out in the wilderness areas, don't bring them. Just like you shouldn't bring any non-natives out to a wilderness area, so a natural area. So that's worms in a nutshell.
Great. And then we have somebody asking, are there any risks of using on-farm pig manure or chicken manure? What about compared to horse manure?
Okay, well, chicken manure and horse manure are herbivores, and for that reason, their manure tends to be less pathogenic to humans than carnivores. And as far as I know, pigs tend to be omnivores, and you could probably compost their manure, but I am not sure. I'm not an expert on pig manure and how safe it may or may not be. If this is one household pig that you have, I would compost the pig manure in a pig manure pile and mix it with enough carbon material and cover it with enough carbon material to filter out the odors that might be generated. But by the time in general, manure, a good rule of thumb, if you're not sure if manure is completely composted, let it compost for a year or more. And by the time these organisms have been working on it for a year, any pathogens should be gone, and it will be just like soil. So does that answer it?
I think so.
Oh, I didn't really talk about chicken manure. Chicken manure is high in nitrogen, so you'll need to add a lot of carbon to make that so it's not too hot and doesn't smell, but it will compost fine. Yeah, chicken manure is great, and horse manure is great. Horse manure often comes with bedding, and the mix of the manure and the bedding is often right around that 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio all on its own. So that's why horse manure piles, after a year or so, will shrink down and make a beautiful compost. A lot of times you can find red wiggler worms in old horse manure piles. I forgot to mention that. So if you have a source of horse manure and you dig into the pile and you see red wiggler, these little red worms, those are your compost worms, and you can bring those indoors. And that's also a sign that your compost is safe to use because it's not hot enough to kill off the earthworms. Fresh manure tends to be very hot because of nitrogen. So you want to age it and let it compost for at least a year.
We did have somebody say the guy on the old Victory Garden used to say the best manure for compost is whichever one you can get for free.
I agree.
Somebody's asking, yeah.
Although I have one thing to add. The kind of manure I think is the best is the worm manure. I didn't mention that. The worm, it's called worm castings. For some reason, I don't know why, but the compost that the worms produce is like super duper compost. It makes plants grow like crazy. It makes seeds germinate. They think it has rooting hormones in it or something similar. They don't know exactly why it's so great, but worm manure is I think the best. But any kind you get for free, they're all good.
And do you have, I know you had on your previous slide a company that was selling the worms, but are there other places?
Yes,
that
there
we can
are.
Get worms?
Yes, we don't have a state contract for worms, so I don't really have a listing, but if you go online and Google or search on red worms or compost worms, you'll find other sources as well. There's another source in Massachusetts, actually. I believe they're still selling worms called Mass Natural, and they're in Westminster, Mass. And they started out as a chicken farm, and they composted the chicken manure, and then they started adding red wigglers to speed up that process. And now I believe they sell the red wigglers. So if you want local, Mass Natural is another source.
Awesome, thank you. We did have somebody who wanted to have you review this sort of historical system of burying the food scraps in the yard and then planting above that and then switching where you're planting your garden.
Sure, yes. What's it called? Oh, it's sort of, okay, so if you have a space in your yard where you want to garden, what you can do is, trench, that's the word I'm looking for. It's called trench composting. You divide your space up into, like say it's a rectangle, divide it up into like 3 sections lengthwise. And your middle section, the first year, could be your pathway. And then on each side of your pathway, you can dig a trench. Or if you don't have enough room for 3 and you just have 2, then dig a trench on one side about 6 inches, 6 to 8 inches deep. You don't really have to go too much deeper than that. Say 8 inches. Dig a trench 8 inches deep, or you can just do it as you go. Once you get your shovel out there, it might be easier to dig your trench all at once. And then, you can put your soil on the side of the trench and then throw in your food scraps and then take some of the soil that you've piled up and throw it on top of those food scraps, and it will kill the odor and it won't attract animals. and you'll get earthworms coming there because it's like a little surface set worm compost setup. At least that's been my experience with that. So then, as often as you have those food scraps, you dump them in your trench and you bury them. Hopefully you don't run out of trench before you run out of time. And then the following, okay, so that's your trench. And then for your garden, so if you only have two, then one side is you're gonna garden and have a tiny little path in between and have one bed next to your trench could be a garden bed, and then where you plant. And then the following season, you switch over your trench to where your garden bed was, and you dig a trench there and start burying your food waste there. And then on the side where you had buried your food scraps all season, you loosen up the soil and plant your garden there. And you should have nice rich soil and a space to dig and bury your food scraps adjacent to that or on the other side of that for that season. And then you just keep switching back and forth each season. Hopefully it works as easily as it sounds. Nothing ever is quite as easy in practice, but you can make it work.
Okay, that's great. I think that we haven't had any other questions, so I think we're probably all set to wrap up.
Great.
I don't see any other questions coming in, so I just want to say thank you very much for participating and providing us with so much information, and we'll post these slides online so that folks can take a look at them later. And we just really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. It was my pleasure. It was, I only missed the hands-on touching. When I give a workshop, I usually pass around some compost, so I missed that. I missed that earthy smell, but hopefully we got the main points across. So thanks so much for having me. It was really a lot of fun.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we'll see everybody on the rest of our fun Earth Week activities. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Ann.
Thanks,
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.